Today we are commemorating ANZAC Day, the day we remember those nurses who served and those who gave their lives while serving in Australia's Army, Navy or Air Force or in related organisations, such as the Red Cross. This year is particularly poignant as we remember the ANZAC soldiers who served 100 years ago. But there are another set of ANZACs, those nurses who served on the hospital ships and on Lemnos Island who are entitled to wear the ANZAC A on their uniform. And hopefully everything works. One shown in this picture is Muriel Bradbury from Tasmania. In April 1915, 18 Australian nurses sailed to Lemnos under secret orders, and on the 25th of April they waited on the British hospital ships, the Cecilia and the Gascon, to serve their part in the campaign for the Dardanelles. 4 of the nurses were privately employed by Mr. Fred Bird, a notable surgeon of Spring Street, Melbourne, who had gone to war with his senior theatre nurses, who became known as the Ladybirds. The 14 nurses of the Australian Army Nursing Service on the ships were volunteers for sea service from No. 2 Australian General Hospital in Egypt, and, according to a senior medical officer, were chosen as they were superfluous to the needs of the hospital at the time. It was envisaged that military hospitals would soon land on the peninsula and the hospital ship work would largely be that of transport duty and serious nursing would be unnecessary. We now know that this was not the case. I recently found a letter written by Sister Ella Tucker from Tasmania, who had joined the Cecilia just before the campaign began. It was a multinational experience for her. She wrote that most of the ship's crew were Indians, also the ship doctors' orderlies, dressers, waiters and stewards. And I quote, "The colonel and medical officers are from India, but of course imperial men. Colonel Bird and his son are Australians, and there are 12 nurses. The boat is fitted with 5 large wards, with 2 officer wards, special wards and a nice little theatre. One night at sea was fairly rough, but everybody was able to appear at table. We were very keen to do so, as we were chosen on account of being good sailors." She was then transferred to the hospital ship Gascon and went up to ANZAC Cove on the 25th of April. She wrote in her letter that the ship was right up in the firing line of the Navy. About 2 a.m, the first shot was fired. About 9 a.m, the first patients were brought on board. It was awful to see them, some with scarcely any clothes on, blood pouring in all directions. Some limping gaily along, others with an arm bandaged. Several died as they came across in the boat to us. It was absolutely grand to see how game they were. I felt just proud of being an Australian and owning them. But they just poured into the wards all day. My ward holds 96 and I was responsible for about 40 on deck. I had 3 orderlies and a sergeant major to assist. She described life at ANZAC Cove for a hospital ship nurse on that fateful day. The deck was just alive with patients lying on mattresses. 530 patients, though our boat was only fitted up for 400. You can imagine how we all worked until we got to Alexandria, again early on Thursday morning. Landing the patients was a pathetic sight. Hardly any of them had shirts. They were so blood-stained and torn, they had to be thrown overboard. Others had coat and trousers split and hurriedly sewn over. Some were minus a boot and very many were minus socks. It took hours getting the stretcher cases off. She also noticed, sadly, one day we had to bury 6 at sea and another day several. And you can note here that they used the Union Jack for the caskets. From this inauspicious start and within weeks, it was apparent from the number of wounded and the lack of progress forward that an increased hospital ship presence would be required. By January 1916, more than 100 professionally trained Australian nurses had served on hospital ships and on black transport ships, receiving both sick and wounded and taking them from ANZAC Cove, Cape Helles and Suvla Bay and transporting them to the safety of the hospitals of Lemnos and Imbros Island, Malta, England or Egypt. Over the duration of the campaign for the Dardanelles, these women served on at least 15 of the more than 25 hospital ships which sailed to and from Gallipoli and comprised the ferry service. As there were few shore-based medical facilities on the narrow beaches of the peninsula, evacuation by sea was imperative. In these ships, with often less than 1 mile from shore, nurses came face to face with the reality of wounded men straight from the line. This meant continuing first aid, such as cleaning wounds, applying dressings until they ran out, pain management, and offering food to men who'd often not eaten for some time. The work was hard and continuous. When off ANZAC and Suvla, these nurses often worked 16 to 18 hours a day. Much of the ferry service was not connected to the experience of the Australian troops. Hilda Sampsing from the Melbourne Hospital served on the Gascon in August and went up to Cape Helles. She wrote, "We stayed 6 days, took on 90 cot cases and 230 fleet sweeper men. We had very few serious cases, but all the head cases died. 2 gas gangrene cases, both wounded in the thigh." She was perturbed by those men who died and critical of the medical officers who seemed to just do nothing but leave things alone. "It just breaks me up to see the poor boys go." Work on hospital ships was not always predictable. Hilda Sampsing reported, "On the 27th, we left Mudros for Imbros to take slightly wounded and medical cases from the beach hospital. We should have sailed at 8 a.m, but some brass hat left the sailing orders in the typewriter and it wasn't discovered till 8:30 p.m. Then we were rushed off, but it was too late when we got to Imbros at 9 o'clock to get into the harbour, so we anchored on the west side. And at 1 a.m, a trawler came out to us with a load from ANZAC. It was very rough and it took ages to get her alongside. The poor patients were wet and chilled, having had 4 hours getting over, and the decks wet all the time." By this time, the volume of wounded changed to masses of sick men, and she wrote in her diary, "Some are very ill, mostly medical cases, enteric, dysentery and pneumonia. They looked so spent when they came up the gangway that it made me think of dead men, walking in their grave clothes. Their clothes are covered with earth from sleeping and living in dugouts. They do look better today after food and sleep. The greater number of sick men are in the lots below, and we have them sorted out a little and things are settling down." Most ferry service nurses were very fortunate that members of the ship's crews also helped look after the patients in any way they could. Hilda thought her chief steward was a good fellow as he went round all the decks to see that everyone had food. I also want to highlight the personal experience of Sister Elsie Eglinton from South Australia, and it was the biggest thrill for me this week to be contacted by her family. She trained at Adelaide Hospital, graduating in 1909, so she had a great deal of experience to bring to her war nursing. After a month of dealing with Gallipoli casualties at No. 2 Australian General Hospital in Egypt and working at a British hospital in Alexandria, she volunteered for the ferry service. Her letters to her mother at the Australian War Memorial give us a realistic rather than heroic picture of nursing on board ships at Gallipoli. She nursed on 4 British ships, because there were no Australian ships up at the peninsula. These were the hospital ship Dunluce Castle, the Gallica, the transport the Ionian and the Gloucester Castle, so she gives us a very rounded view of life at sea. She'd also had the bonus of already working in Egypt with English nursing sisters, who she found most dignified yet sympathetic with the patients and good nurses. You can see here the different uniforms they wore compared with the Australian uniform on the right. So when she joined the Dunluce Castle, although the matron was Australian and there was another Australian sister on board, the rest of the nurses were English. As Ella Tucker did, she quickly found herself on the way to Lemnos, busily making up beds, cutting dressings and getting wards ready for the patients. She did know what was in store for her. She wrote, "We have opened great cases of Red Cross comforts as we are expecting to take on 600 or more wounded." The horror ourselves before morning. So the first thing we do when we come off duty in the morning is to get into a hot bath and scald our underclothes. It's too uncomfortable to try and eat breakfast first. By August, when the big stunt of Lone Pine occurred, she was begging for folks at home to send plenty of face washes in your Red Cross boxes. We can't get nearly enough to go around. I've cut up everything I can spare, even calico aprons, and then I only have about 10 washes for every 100 patients. But she didn't lose her sense of humour. Just now, I'm making a collection of soap. I had to wash my poor boys with soap that the decks were scrubbed with, and I was lucky to get it, as it's a special favour bestowed on me by one of the stewards. But I am afraid it will shrink the poor boys. It's so dreadfully hard. And at the height of the effort to remove the wounded from the August attack, she lamented, "I often wish I had a dozen pair of hands. I'm sure I could keep them all busy without getting in a tangle." Life aboard a ship off the Gallipoli coast was not entirely safe. The hospital ships were often within range of Turkish artillery, and their soldiers commonly took pot shots at the men. Even in the comparative safety of the ships, both soldiers and medical staff were in danger. German submarines also arrived to hunt Allied ships throughout the Mediterranean during the campaign. The nurses, aware of a possible enemy threat, prepared for any eventuality. At night, the scuttles were closed, and nurses learned that the order, "show no lights," meant there was a risk of submarine attack. Elsie felt that the dim light in the holds made observing and treating her patients harder, but she found her electric torch a great help. We get round the deck with a torch in one hand and just flash it on for a moment when absolutely necessary. Some recognition for the nurses' courage and initiative came in honours lists. At least 10 Australian ANZAC nurses, including Elsie, were mentioned in dispatches in March 1916 by Lieutenant General Maxwell for distinguished service and with their skill and fortitude while attending the wounded off the coast of Gallipoli. At the end of the campaign, the Australian seagoing nurses returned to their land-based hospitals. We were all sorry to break up. No one on board ship ever went to bed or off duty till every man had been washed, fed and his dressings done. No one felt for themselves until everything was done, and I felt it a privilege to be so near the front to get them right away. While the nurses remembered their boys and felt pride in their accomplishments, today we pay tribute to those women, lest we forget.